Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director here at Word on Fire Catholic Ministries. Joining us is Bishop Robert Barron from Santa Barbara, California. Bishop Barron, good to see you.
Hey, Brandon. Always a joy to be on with you.
Now, we're recording this a couple weeks before it actually airs, and as it stands now, you're about to travel all the way to the East Coast, to my side of the country. You're visiting Washington, D.C. for a couple of really cool events. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I've had a crazy fall. I've been doing all kinds of different things, and just got back, from Rome and from England. But I'm going to D.C. to speak at the Library of Congress, and I'll be addressing congressmen, senators, I hope, and those who work on Capitol Hill. They wanted to talk like the ones I gave at Google and Facebook, kind of addressing the secular world from a religious perspective. So I'm doing that. We'll see how that goes. I think we're going to record it and live stream it and all that, but that's coming up. And I've got to go back again to Baltimore about a week later for the USCCB meeting. So it's been a crazy fall.
Now, for the events in Washington, D.C., is it the Library of Congress? Or you're addressing Congress, right? I thought it was you're in the House of Representatives chamber or something like that.
Well, I'm going to be there to say a prayer. So I'm going to open the session, I think, the day afterwards. So I'll be there for that. But no, I won't be in the chamber speaking. It'll be in the Library of Congress.
Very good. Well, for this episode, we're going to follow up on last week's episode. If you remember, we started discussing this big new interview between Joe Rogan, who's a very popular podcasting host and a former Catholic, and Richard Dawkins, probably the world's most famous atheist. Dawkins just released a new book titled Outgrowing God, A Beginner's Guide, which is sort of a manual of atheism aimed at young adults and teenagers, aimed at young people. So Joe invited Richard Dawkins onto his program to discuss the book. The interview went immediately viral. I think within 24 hours, it already had 1 million views. And we discussed the first half of it last week. So if you missed that, go back and listen. This week, we're going to cover the second half, and we're going to do the same thing. Just play short little 30-second, 60-second clips, and then Bishop Barron will share his thoughts. So let's start off here. This is right at about the halfway point here, and Richard Dawkins raises the question of whether you need faith in order to be a moral person. Here's the clip.
They think that you've got to have a belief in some kind of higher power in order to be moral. But the weird thing is that it doesn't have to be the same higher power as the one you believe in. Anyone will do, right, as long as there is one. But if you don't believe in a higher power, you must be immoral. And that is totally ridiculous when you think about the horrible immorality of, for example, both the Bible and the Quran, which are horrific in the sense that if you actually got your morals, if you got your moral values from the Old Testament or the Quran, and they share them a great deal, of course, you would be stoning adulterers to death and stoning people to death for breaking the Sabbath and doing sacrifices, human sacrifices and animal sacrifices.
All right, Bishop, let's maybe break this into two. So the first part he was saying is, religious people say you have to have faith in order to be a moral person. Is that true?
Well, no, and we addressed it last week. No, I think you can be an upright moral person and not believe in God explicitly. But what you can't do is ultimately justify the objectivity of your moral values apart from God. So they're two different questions. So no, I wouldn't deny that an atheist can be a good moral person, but he or she has a hard time justifying their moral structure apart from God. So I'd make that distinction. The second half now, it's opening up a whole set of complicated issues. Let me say this first of all. Bracket for a second everything that people perceive as negative in the Bible. It's very hard to deny, at least in the Western cultures, that the best of our moral principles have come to us from the Bible. Love and compassion, the nonviolence taught in the Sermon on the Mount, love even of enemies, turn the other cheek, forgiveness of those who've harmed us, forgiving even those who are putting you to death, to follow the example of Jesus. These extraordinarily powerful, unique, distinctive moral points of view. One that we see, I think, Brandon, today especially, is the concern for the marginalized. I mean, how basic that is to our sensibility. Well, at root, that's a biblical idea. Show that to me in classical philosophical ethics. On the contrary, Marginalized people are kept in the margins, pushed further away. So there's something, I think, deeply ungrateful, not only superficial intellectually, but kind of ungrateful when you say that, oh, the Bible has nothing to do with our moral sensibility. It has an awful lot to do with the values that we take as most central. Now, the negative business. I'll just say a couple simple things. One is, within the Bible itself, you see a sort of gradual appropriation of the revelation of God. St. Irenaeus saw this long ago, 2nd century. He was arguing this, that you see in the Bible the steady education of Israel, the steady education of the human race under God's grace. Does that mean that every single thing in the Bible represents simply and straightforwardly what God wants? No. To some degree, we see certain culturally relative forms that represent the consensus of that time of what God wanted, what God desired. But there's an evolution. And we Christians see the entire Bible from the standpoint of the end of the Bible, which is to say, the dying and rising of Jesus. And so, of course, things that were recommended and urged, some things in the Old Testament, we don't hold to. So go through much of the book of Leviticus, for example. We don't hold to those things. And the Christian tradition from the earliest days has acknowledged this, that we don't simply have a univocal, uncritical approach to every little thing in the Bible, but we recognize a certain evolution within the Bible. Second simple observation, again, there's much more to say about it. A lot of the stories of putting the ban on cities, kill every man, woman, and child, and animal in the city, these sort of brutal commands of God. Our great spiritual and theological masters have read those allegorically as accounts of the struggle against evil. So the thoroughgoing warfare that ought to happen within us, within our community, against forms of evil. What we tend to do is we make little compromises, like we fight evil to a degree. The Bible is saying, as these spiritual masters interpret it, no, certain evil has to be fought all the way down. You've got to put the ban on it. Again, a contemporary reading, by no means. That's a very ancient way of reading these texts in the Bible. So here, my overall point, again, we could go on and on, Brandon, about this. The overall point is, don't read these texts in a sort of ham-handed, superficial, fundamentalistic, univocal way. They should be read with an interpretive delicacy to see what we're dealing with. Bottom line, what's Christian ethics? It's the Jesus from his cross saying, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. Jesus saying to those who had abandoned him at the moment of truth, Shalom, right? That if you want biblical ethics, there it is. And what's best in the ethics of Western society comes precisely from there.
When Dawkins released his initial best-selling book, at least in this genre, The God Delusion, he was widely pilloried by religious believers because he had his sights set on the Old Testament violent passages and was criticizing them ruthlessly as examples of, unjustified, intense violence. But many critics observed, well, to criticize it as wrong, you need some sort of objective frame of moral reference. And going back to what we've already discussed, that's precisely what atheism doesn't provide. And so you need to have some ground of moral values, moral facts, in order to critique the Old Testament passages on violence.
And where are those coming from? I would argue they come largely from the Bible itself, that positive moral framework.
All right, let's move on to the next clip. Here we have Richard Dawkins and Joe Rogan discussing Jesus's existence. So finally, we're moving from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Dawkins gives another little flippant remark, which he gave earlier in their discussion about whether Jesus even existed at all, much less perform some of the miracles the Gospels have him performing. So here's the clip.
So you do think he was a real person?
Most of the scholars I've talked to say he probably was. The evidence is not great, of course, but I think I don't think it's that big a deal, actually, because a wandering preacher called Yeshua or Yehoshua would not be surprising. It's a common name,
right.
And there are plenty of wandering preachers. What would be very surprising would be if he raised Lazarus from the dead and walked on water and turned water into wine. And that, of course, did not happen.
Well, why couldn't people just drink water either? Why did they have to drink wine? He's trying to get people drunk? Like, what's that all about?
Well, that's a separate question. I think the point I'm making is that it's a very big difference to say, did he exist? And maybe he did, maybe he didn't. Who cares, really? Or that's very different from saying that a miracle worker who really did do miracles rather than conjuring tricks existed.
Yes.
All right, Bishop, maybe we break this one up into two questions, just like the last one. So the first one is there good evidence that Jesus existed? And secondly, does it matter, like for the sake of Christianity, whether Jesus actually existed or not?
Well, first of all, there's extraordinary evidence. I agree with those. There's been a kind of revolution here, Brandon, in recent years. The scholars who say we have better evidence for the existence of Jesus historically than for almost any other figure from the ancient world. What people often do is they suddenly set the bar impossibly high when it comes to religious claims. But, Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, Hammurabi, Ramesses, go through all these figures from the ancient world. We have far more credible historical, textual evidence for the existence of Jesus than for almost any of these figures. So if you're going to call the existence of Jesus into question, you'd have to question practically every other figure from the ancient world. See, the problem is, of course, there's a prejudice already in place that any claim to the supernatural is illegitimate. And so any text that claims to be historical and contains something supernatural, ipso facto has to be wrong. Well, that's enormously question-begging. I mean, that's the very thing we're interested in. Read people like N.T. Wright, read E.P. Sanders, read Craig Keener, read Richard Bauckham. There's a whole slew of scholars. Read Brant Petrie, who have made this very thoroughgoing case that the historical existence of Jesus is extremely well documented.
Well, I'll add to that list the book by Dr. Bart Ehrman, probably the most famous skeptical biblical scholar. I think he describes himself as agnostic sometimes, atheist and other times. He wrote a whole book defending the existence of Jesus and says no serious scholar questions the existence of Jesus.
Right.
Okay. Well,
I think we're clearer on that now than we were even like 40, 50 years ago.
How about the second part of that question? It reminds me of our friend Dr. Jordan Peterson when he talks about Jesus. And it's in a similar way. He talks about what Jesus said and did, but when you press him on the metaphysical question of whether Jesus existed, I think to him it's not terribly important whether there was an actual real Jesus, whether he did historically rise from the dead. It seems like Dawkins is sort of moving down that path. Does it actually matter for religion or Christianity that there was a historical Jesus?
Well, massively, yeah. And I've commented before on Jordan Peterson that there's something very Kantian in his approach. Because remember, Kant says that Jesus represents the archetype of the person perfectly pleasing to God, which is a kind of pictorial representation of the demand of the categorical imperative, to give it all its Kantian language.
That's exactly how I was going to put it. I'm glad you said it before me, though.
But the point there is that it doesn't really matter whether this figure existed historically. What matters is he represents in a pictorial way the demand of the moral life. Okay, so that's kind of a Kantian, and I recognize some of that in Jordan Peterson, though I also think Peterson is shifting on that a bit. Anyway, Dawkins says, so what? There's this wandering preacher called Yeshua. Well, yeah, if that's all that was being claimed, that there was a wandering first century Jewish preacher called Yeshua, but what makes him so interesting is the claims he made about himself. So as C.S. Lewis clearly saw, sure, maybe a madman would make claims like I and the Father are one, and before Abraham was, I am, and my son, your sins are forgiven, and heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Jesus speaks and acts in the very person of God, which makes him an utterly distinctive, unique, strange, disturbing figure. Now, had he simply died, stayed in his grave, and that was the end of it, you'd say, well, the poor deluded, madman. What's really interesting is, and N.T. Wright makes this point, is the very emergence of Christianity as a messianic movement. because there was no clearer indication that someone was not the Messiah of Israel, which Jesus claimed to be, than his death at the hands of Israel's enemies. That was the clearest indication possible that you were not the Messiah. But yet these first Christians going all over the world and to their deaths claiming he is the Messiah of Israel. He is who he claimed to be. How do you explain that? And I think that's where the real drama of it comes in. And I would say that's where the credibility of the resurrection is very much brought to the fore. What led them to say, yes, he is who he claimed to be? It was this extraordinary experience of the resurrection. Now, is the resurrection describing an event that happened in history or just a fantasy of the disciples? I might recommend N.T. Wright's 900-page book called The Resurrection of the Son of God, if you want a really thorough look at the historicity of the resurrection. But I mean, to dismiss Jesus simply as this wandering first century prophet, well, yeah, if that's all he was, who cares? But it's the extraordinary claims he made, backed up by the miracles, yes, but ultimately the resurrection, which was then propagated by people who claimed to have seen him and spoken to him after his resurrection. That's where Christianity comes from. Now, hard to believe? Yeah, it always has been. You know, I mean, I'll say with Kierkegaard, in a way that the point of theology is to make Christianity hard to believe. In other words, to keep bringing forward its wonderful strangeness. Do you think first century people said, oh yeah, sure, a guy rose from the dead, carpenter rose from the dead. Yeah, sure, of course. Well, come on. They had the same hesitations and same skepticism. What's really interesting is the sheer power of these first witnesses that came bursting forth with such authority and such enthusiasm that they did indeed set their world on fire. That's historically a very interesting thing.
All right. In the next clip, they turn back to Richard Dawkins' new book, which I mentioned at the beginning. It's kind of the focus of the interview. And Joe Rogan asks him to summarize the two halves of his book. Again, the book's called Outgrowing God, A Beginner's Guide. So here's Dawkins summarizing his book.
Now, when you set out to write this book and write it for young people, how did you structure it in your mind? Did you think of it as addressing young people with questions that are trying to find?
Sort of, yes. It's in two halves. The first half is debunking God. It begins with what we were talking about earlier, the sheer number of different gods, and then moves on to the Bible and how unreliable a source of information it is. And both the Old Testament and the New Testament, they get a chapter each. And then there's a couple of chapters on morality and why you don't need or not only do you not need religion to be moral, you better not have religion if you want to be moral. And then the second half of the book is about science, because I think that one of the, possibly the major reason people still cling to religion is a belief that the world is so complicated, especially the living world is so complicated, that it cannot be explained by purely scientific means. And so I've set out to disabuse them of that and to show how even the most radically complicated and beautiful and elegant pieces of animal design can be and are explained by science. So that's most of the second half.
Bishop, we haven't really talked about science at all vis-a-vis Richard Dawkins, but I think one of the fundamental components of the whole new atheist movement that Dawkins spearheaded was the pretension that science and religion are at odds, that science has now explained all the things religion used to try to explain. And it seems like that's a major centerpiece of this new book by Dawkins. So what do you think about his description of the second half of his book, which aims to show that, hey, most people hang on to religion today because the world's so complicated and they're not aware that science can explain it, but it can?
Yeah. Here's the first observation, especially for young people that might be listening, or if people want to send this to their kids or grandchildren. If you have the impression that somehow Richard Dawkins is the first one to make this claim, may I disabuse you of that? People have been saying now for roughly 300 years exactly what he just said there. Namely, science now We're going to get rid of all this old superstition. We can debunk religion. We can explain everything. Religion's going to fade away. They've been saying that for 300 years. And last time I checked, religion goes up and down, and it's got its problems today for sure, but it has not gone away. We've been hearing people like Richard Dawkins for a long time making exactly the same argument. Now, why is it not working? It's not working because religion is responding to another kind of question. There are scientific questions, to be sure. And speaking as a Catholic, I love the sciences. Go all the way with the sciences. Do everything you want to do with the sciences. God gave us minds. God imbued the world with intelligibility, which is why the sciences can exist, by the way. God wants us to explore all we can. So talk to evolutionary biologists, talk to physicists, talk to chemists, talk to astrophysicists. Terrific. I am completely, utterly in favor of it. I've got nothing against it. However, a scientism is an ideological view that reduces all of knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. That's a serious problem. I could argue on philosophical grounds that there's a realm of being that's opened up by a philosophical type of reason that is not accessible to the sciences. For example, why is a moral act good or bad? Why is something beautiful, a work of art? Why is a particular political arrangement just or unjust? Why is something a true act of knowledge versus an illusion? Why is there something rather than nothing? Those are all examples of properly philosophical questions, which are not accessible to the scientific through the scientific method. Now, go a step further. Religion deals with, Paul Tillich's language, ultimate concern. Thomas Aquinas, it deals with ipsum esse, with the sheer act of to be itself. It deals with communications that have come from the deepest ground of being. Are those scientific matters? Absolutely not. Are they at odds with science? No. The same God that produces the intelligibility of nature also produces his revelation. They're not at odds, but don't reduce religion to science. So I would say that to young people. First of all, be very wary of this salesman, because people like him have been saying exactly the same thing for 300 years. How come it hasn't worked? Because they're not sensing, it seems to me sufficiently, this distinction between different orders of being and different types of knowing. Religion has its own independent integrity.
I guess what confuses me most about Dawkins' assertion is bracketing, the subgenre of intelligent design theorists, most of whom are evangelical Protestants or fundamental Protestants, who are seeking to put God in as the answer to biological complexity. Putting that aside, besides that, I don't know any other Christians who embrace their religion simply because they think it answers scientific questions that science has failed to answer. And I mean that sincerely. I mean, if I went to my parish and asked anybody why they believe in God or why they go to church, I don't think any of them would say, well, it's because, otherwise I can't explain the complexity of the eyeball or that, how species evolved. Like, to me, I just don't even know anybody who would bring up this objection.
Yeah, it's construing religion as primitive science, and that's a typical modern prejudice. It's primitive science, so we kind of pat it on the head and we hope it just goes away while we move on with our project. Well, the very fact that religion has persisted, despite this claim being made for 300 years, I think is in itself extremely interesting.
Okay, let's move on. We've only got a couple more clips here. This one is Richard Dawkins and Joe Rogan discussing the age-old question, who designed the designer? So if you think you have a designer of the world and that's God, well, who designed God, or what caused God? So here's the clip.
It's kind of pardonable that people should think there must have been a designer. But then you think a bit further and then you realize that the designer himself would need just the same kind of explanation. And therefore the designer is not an explanation that flies. And philosophers before Darwin, philosophers like Hume realized that, but didn't have anything to put in its place. Darwin came along and gave them that which you need to put in its place. And Hume would have loved Darwin if only he'd lived long enough to meet him, to meet his ideas. So I think we have to have sympathy for people who think that complexity must mean design. But nowadays we know better, and that's what the second half of Outgrowing God is about.
Who designed the designer? That's the big conundrum for people who believe in God.
Yes, it is, and they shrug it off. They say, "Oh well, he didn't need a designer; he was always there."
Well, my favorite one is, why did he wait until 6,000 years ago to make the world?
I know exactly. Yes, that
seems like.
All right, again, let's break it up into two parts, Bishop.
Yeah.
Is this a big conundrum for religious believers? Who designed the designer?
No, and I'm surprised, Brandon, how often it comes forward in different versions. What you'll often hear is, well, okay, this required a cause, and so that required a cause, and you go back and back till you come to the first cause, God. Well, then what caused God? People say, The principle is not all things require a cause. The principle is contingent things require a cause. Things that don't explain themselves require a cause. And so the classic arguments begin with this fact of the contingent world, which is evident to our immediate experience. The things that come into being and pass away, they don't carry within themselves the reason for their being. On that basis, I can say, yes, indeed, there must be a cause. And let's say that one itself is contingent, it must need a cause, etc. That kind of series has to end in some reality that doesn't require a cause, because it's not in itself contingent. Rather, it explains its own existence. So the principle is not, oh, well, everything needs a cause. Well, therefore, how about God? He needs a cause too. No, contingent things need a cause. But we finally come to a reality that is not contingent and therefore doesn't require a cause. And this is what people call God. So in a way, it's a very sophomoric objection.
Bishop, let me interject and ask the follow-up. I know some people might be thinking, why can't you just have an infinite regress of contingent beings? Why does it have to stop?
Because in that kind of causal series, the suppression of the first element would entail the suppression of all subsequent causality. So to say infinite series is just a shorthand for there is no ultimate source. You're permanently postponing the answer to the question. What causes this contingent state of affairs? You say an infinite series, that's explaining nothing. It says there is no ultimate ground for it. But that gives the lie to the fact that contingent state of affairs does actually exist.
Okay, let's go to the second half of that little exchange. It was a little quip at the end by Rogan. He said, well, why did he wait around until 6,000 years ago? And I guess what he's saying is, why did he wait to create humans till 6,000 years ago? Because presumably God has existed long before that. But how would you respond to that?
Well, a couple of things. One is, it's silly. I mean, only fundamentalists would hold that the world is 6,000 years old. I mean, no serious person holds that. We listen to the scientists to tell us. What's the latest figure? Like 13.5 billion or something is the age of the universe. The Earth is 5 billion or something. Fine, I'll listen to the scientists. That's not a religious question. How old is the physical universe? It's nothing to do with it. What's interesting philosophically is it's not as though now God's in time and he's moving along and then he decides, I think at this moment I'm going to create, That's making that same mistake about time and eternity. God is outside of time. So the creation of the world coincides with the creation of time itself. Time is a creature. And so it's not like there's a time prior, like what God's hanging out for 12 billion years and then he decides. That's just the wrong way to think of a time relationship. Can I say a quick thing too, Brandon, before we go about the design thing? With you, I want to bracket the intelligent design thing. That's a whole other thing, and I'm not going to get into that. I'm not an advocate of that. But there's an interesting metaphysical argument here, namely about parts and wholes. If something's composed of parts, we must assume that there's some extrinsic cause that put them together. To speak of parts is to speak of things that are connected, but they're discrete. That's to say they're connected, but they don't have to be connected, right? So this microphone, I don't know if you can see it in front of me here, is made up of a number of parts that are connected, but they're not intrinsically related to each other. So I correctly assume, they were put together by an extrinsic cause, the engineer and the designer and whoever made it, right? Now, that's true of anything you look at in the world that's composed of parts, including our own bodies. We have to look for an extrinsic cause that brings together these parts. Now, press it further at the metaphysical level. if something is composed, for example, of matter and form, those Aristotelian principles, right? The stuff and then the inherent intelligibility, matter and form. If they've come together, well, who brought them together? Who brought this particular matter and this particular form together? Well, some extrinsic cause must have done that, right? Now, our infinite causal series problem. So how about that thing that brought them together? Is that made up of parts? Let's suppose it is. Well, then that had to be caused by something outside itself. What do you have to come to? Finally, some reality which is not composed of parts in any sense. Some reality whose very nature simply is to be, who is not assembled either physically or metaphysically by any extrinsic cause. Now, if you want, that reality is the ultimate designer of the world. I would say the ultimate cause of those things that are metaphysically or physically complex. That being is correctly defined as utterly simple, right? And there's Thomas Aquinas, that God is, period. He simply is. Now, the reason that's important is, who put together the ultimate complexity of God? If I say, the world's made up of like a complex computer, so who put it together? Well, then God's got to be even more complex than that, right? No, on the contrary. God is, if you want, less. He has no complexity in him. God is the utterly simple act of to be itself. Simplicity is more metaphysically basic and impressive than complexity, the way I'm laying it out. So I would actually turn that whole design thing on its head and say it's a very powerful argument for God's existence.
If you want more on that, and much more can be said, I highly recommend Dr. Edward Fazer's book, 5 Proofs for the Existence of God. This is one of the 5 lines of arguments that he takes to God, and he does it meticulously over dozens and dozens of pages. So if you want more on that line of argument, check out that book. Okay, Bishop, let's close with one final clip. This is right at the end of the interview here, and Dawkins gives one more explanation of why people adopt the religion that they do.
People who are religious almost certainly adopt the religion of their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. And so we've got a kind of pseudo-genetic inheritance going on. And I really hate that. I mean, that's wicked. That's indoctrination of children. So I've always wanted to try to break that chain going down the generations. So I've always wanted to write a book for young people.
All right, Bishop.
So he can indoctrinate them in his position. I mean, I just don't see it's so question begging. I mean, what's that but an indoctrination? And see, the point, Brandon, is like it or not, every kid is indoctrinated. The very fact that I came to speak English, well, I didn't choose that. It's just this world I grew up in. I was conditioned by my parents to speak English. That I was sent to the schools I was sent to, conditioned the way I came to know things. That I was brought into the world of baseball instead of the world of cricket. Okay, that's because my parents did it. That isn't in itself oppressive. It's just a given in the way human beings are formed. So Richard Dawkins wants to indoctrinate children into atheism. So the point is, eventually one reaches the moment when he or she says, okay, what do I believe? I know I've received a number of beliefs from my parents. That's just inevitable. There's no way around that. But can I reach the point where I say, no, on my own, having examined the question more deeply, having looked at alternatives, I say, yeah, and I hold to this. What also gives a lie to that point of view is the very fact of conversion. There are a lot of examples of people that convert from the religion that they received to another religion. Okay, they came to the point where they looked at it more honestly and so on, and they made their own judgment. Fair enough. But it's an enlightenment fantasy to think that we can create, some perfectly neutral condition. Because the reason I was laughing at it is that it's so obvious, the prejudice that let's get rid of that religious indoctrination and let's give them atheist indoctrination, as though that's more neutral. I mean, what makes that a more objective and rational and neutral perspective? To me, that's just as aggressive and domineering as anyone's religious point of view.
I smile because I myself am, of course, a convert. I was not raised Catholic. I chose Catholic at a later point in my life. I remember listening to a Catholic call-in radio show where the Catholic apologist was fielding questions from people, and an atheist had called in, and he made a lot of the same points Dawkins was making, that all you believers only believe in God or Christianity because that's the way you were raised. And, just like you, your parents raised you Christian, they took you to church, and the host kind of just patiently let all this play out. And then finally, when he finished the diatribe, the host said, well, actually, I was raised atheist and I'm a convert to Catholicism in college. Yeah. And then it just sort of deadened at that point because in his person, he debunked that line of reasoning.
Yeah.
All right. Well, again, it's a really interesting interview. I encourage you to watch the whole thing. It's about an hour long. I think we've maybe covered 20, 30 minutes of it over the last couple of weeks, but it gives you a good sense of two different sides of the religion question. One, you have Joe Rogan, who again is a little hesitant about religion, adds these little jabs here and there, but he seems a little more open-minded. And then you have Richard Dawkins, who's a pretty strident atheist. And I think those are two archetypes of what you'll find among many people in the culture, especially young people. Mm-hmm. So if you're a parent, a priest, an evangelist, teacher, catechist, watch the whole thing. And then think about how you would respond to some of these points yourself. Well, it's time now for a question from one of our listeners. Today, we got a really good question from a man named Robbie. Robbie's from Tennessee, but he lives in Russia. So he's sending this all the way from the other side of the world. Here's Robbie's question.
Hi, my name is Robbie. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee, but currently live in St. Petersburg, Russia. My question is, I want to convert to Catholicism, but I know that'll cause some issues with my Protestant family and possibly my Protestant organization where I work. I was wondering if you had any suggestions as to how to be brave enough to make that big step. Thanks. И до свидания.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I appreciate it very much. I appreciate your honesty about it. I'm always reluctant when I get a question like that from someone that I do not know to give advice because it's such a delicate matter. And I know what you're saying, that maybe you've come to the conclusion that, yes, I should make this change, but I realize personally and professionally, it's really going to cost me. And I respect, the danger and difficulty of that. Look, bottom line is, I think we have to go with what our hearts and minds and souls are telling us. I mean, we have to go with what we think is true. And sometimes that will cost. That's true. But I would love it if you could find someone there. Was it St. Petersburg? Is that where you live? Find somebody there closer to the ground, a priest, preferably, that you could talk to and really share the details of your professional and personal life so that we know prudentially how best to manage this. So I guess I'm saying to you, obviously, as a Catholic priest, as a bishop, if your heart is telling you to convert to Catholicism, yeah, I think you should do it. But I also don't want to make that sound glib and, like, oh yeah, just go ahead and don't worry about it. Talk to someone close to the ground that you can really share the details with. And I think they'll help you move through the thing prudentially.
Yeah, and Robbie, from one convert to a potential convert, I totally sympathize. I know exactly what you're going through. I experienced a lot of it myself. And one thing that really helped me was finding people who had already been down that path, who had already weathered the storm of family and friends and work and all that stuff. And if I could recommend a place to find people like that, check out the Coming Home Network Ministry. It's run by Marcus Grodi. You might recognize him from the EWTN show Journey Home, where he tells the stories of different converts. But the Coming Home Network's website is full of resources, but more importantly, a community of former Protestant pastors, former Protestant ministers, people that work for Protestant ministries. So it sounds like people that might be in your situation that can accompany you and offer you advice and make you aware that you're not alone. People want to walk this path with you. Well, thanks so much for listening to this long two-parter episode. It's been a little longer than we normally do, but we hope that you found it fruitful and helpful. Just a couple final things. One, I mentioned last week, Matt Nelson, the assistant director of the Word on Fire Institute, recently filmed a course on how to evangelize open-minded non-believers, people in the mold of Joe Rogan. In fact, he responds to a lot of Joe Rogan's podcasts and episodes in that course. So look for that soon. You can find that at wordonfire.institute. Join the Institute if you're not already a member. Finally, with Advent right around the corner, we want to mail you a free Advent booklet. You can find this at wordonfireshow.com/Advent. It's a small little booklet, but it contains the gospel reading every day that you'll hear at Mass throughout all of Advent, along with a short commentary reflection from Bishop Barron. So get one for yourself, encourage your parish to order them for all your fellow parishioners, and you can find it at wordonfireshow.com/Advent. Well, thanks so much for listening. We'll see you guys next week on the
The House will be in order. The prayer this morning will be offered by the guest chaplain, Bishop Robert Barron, Archdiocese of Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, California. Welcome.
And let us pray. O God, source of all justice, you've summoned everyone who works in this chamber to walk the path of righteousness, to foster life and liberty, to care especially for the poorest and most vulnerable in our society. Make them mindful of the time when they first heard your voice and followed it with idealism and enthusiasm. Illumine their minds, direct their wills, and shower, O Lord, your choicest blessings upon our country. Amen. This city means a lot to me. I lived here for 3 years when I was a kid studying philosophy at Catholic U. So I came into this airport many times and always kind of feel at home in Washington. I'll be speaking at the Library of Congress tomorrow. And then I'm also giving the opening prayer in the House of Representatives.
Bishop Barron is the #1 best-selling author, and he's spoken to Facebook and Google and Amazon, and now to the United States Congress. Ladies and gentlemen, Bishop Robert Barron.
Thank you so much for that really kind introduction. Here's what I'm not going to do today. I'm not going to talk at all about hot-button issues. Not because I don't think they're important. They are. Serious people engage in those conversations, they're important questions. But see, my concern is that when we rush right away to the hot button issues, we miss sometimes those really deep and abiding points of contact, ways that religion can inform what lawmakers are doing. Could I ask you to go back in your imagination to when you first heard the call? Chances are, when you recover that moment, you found a time of enormous grace, inspiration, and spiritual clarity. The ancient philosophers, they're echoed by all the medievals and many of the moderns too, talk about the 3 transcendental properties of being. Whatever is, in the measure that it is true, beautiful, and good. In Catholic theology, truth itself, goodness itself, justice itself are simply names for God. When you find the moment in your life when you were seized by a passion for justice, you were called by God at that moment. God, justice itself, calls us personally. And what matters is how we respond. Remember that time, all of you, when you first heard the call, and I'll just say it, honestly and bluntly, from God, to do the work of justice. Can you follow the theodrama and let go of the ego drama? Everything else will follow from that.